Welcome back to the Daily Living Jewish class. We are going through the laws of keeping kosher, section 46 of the Kosher Shulchan Aruch. Most recently, we've been learning about the prohibition against eating worms. There's one thing not to eat blood. That's one prohibition. There's another prohibition not to mix milk and meat. Another prohibition, rabbinic prohibition, not to eat unsealed foods that were left not under Jewish supervision, and then non-kosher foods, and then sick animals. These are all things that are not allowed. But most recently, we spoke about worms, and as I mentioned, eating a tiny little worm, one may be violating many more commandments than eating even that same quantity or larger quantity of even pork, because there are many prohibitions associated with worms. And therefore, ironically, a person can be in greater danger when eating vegetable salads. You know, people say, what happens if I go into a non-kosher restaurant and it's okay, all I'm ordering is a salad. So what could be wrong with the salad? Well, was the lettuce checked? I'm sure it wasn't. So that lettuce may have worms, and those worms are a serious problem from a Torah perspective. So ironically, even in fruits and vegetables, one can be eating more non-kosher than by eating a meat of a non-kosher animal. So one must be particularly careful about it, and that's why I see we have about 10 or more halachas in the Kosher Shulchan Aruch dedicated to avoiding eating worms. So most recently, there are many kinds of vegetables that are known to be infested with worms, and some that are infested with mites. Some housewives claim that singeing the vegetables in fire destroys the worms. However, such a method is of no avail. Doesn't help. There are also certain kinds of fruits and vegetables that are so infested with worms that it is almost impossible to examine them. It is fitting, therefore, that a God-fearing Jew should not eat any of these. There are certain fruits whose kernels are infested with worms, and it is forbidden to eat them. So examples of foods that have been on and off the kosher list are, for example, fresh broccoli, the greenery of the fresh broccoli. I don't know what it's, or cauliflower. I know at some point the basin said it's no good because they're very infested and you actually cannot check them properly. At other times, the basin have said that they are okay. It obviously has to do with how the crops are turning out based on evidence, and it will depend on the place. So in one particular place, certain fruits and vegetables, the basin may say is perfectly fine, maybe don't even need to be checked. In other places, the basin will say checking doesn't help because we've checked them and again and again, and they've been evidence has shown that the naked eye does not. Chances are that a person will end up eating worms. So I guess for that, it's worth being in touch with your LOR, local Orthodox rabbi, on the Din regarding particular vegetables to find out about that particular locale, that particular place, if there is a problem of little mites or worms. And even so, sometimes there is a phenomenon. There are certain vegetables that the basin will say is okay, but nonetheless there'll be some God-fearing individuals that will want to avoid them because of concern of it being more difficult to check them and to detect the worms. So just taking cauliflower and broccoli, for example, it's pretty hard to check them because there's a lot of ins and outs. It's like a forest. Try go looking at a forest of trees and trying to spot a bird or a lizard. It's going to be almost impossible. So a little thing of cauliflower or broccoli is like a mini forest. It's pretty hard to see in and out. But that said, these things can sometimes be checked, and therefore one should consult with their local Orthodox rabbi to find out the current status in their particular place of these particular vegetables that may be in question. Strawberries, I know sometimes can be a challenge, but the Beis Din does have a formula of how to check them. I know there's a discussion about whether corn can be eaten off the cob, or if it should first be cut off because of a concern of insects being inside between the kernels. I'm not coming to say what should or shouldn't be done, because as I said, it depends on that time and place. This varies, but these are just a few examples that come to mind. Lettuce is something that needs to be checked. And then there's a whole debate if it's frozen. So some say that once if you take, for example, frozen berries, even though they weren't checked and there is a concern of worms, some say once it's frozen, then the worms kind of break apart. And as I mentioned before, if you don't see it, if you don't notice it, and you don't taste it, and it's incomplete, then it's fine. The issue is if it's complete. If it's complete, even though you don't notice it, as long as it is detectable, it wasn't detected, but it could have been detected, even if you cannot taste it, as long as it's a whole insect, then that makes the food not kosher. But if it's a half an insect and it's not tasteable and you are not detecting it, then that's fine. So some say that once you freeze berries, then what happens is the insects actually kind of crumb apart. Therefore, that's fine. So if you and others say that no, even when it's frozen in a solid state, and so that insect is still in a complete state. It's frozen, but it's still whole, and as long as it's whole, that's a problem. So that's another interesting discussion as far as frozen berries and frozen fruits. And here also sometimes there could be a difference of opinion amongst by beis-dins of different places. And as a result of that, you could also have differences amongst kosher certifications. You could have one beis-din. So every kosher agency needs to have a team of rabbis that are advising, what is the standards. You could have one kosher agency that says that they're happy to, for example, in this instance, they'll say they'll be happy to assume that any fruits that are frozen, the insects are no longer intact, and others will say that no, based on their tests, they think that they are still, and based on that, you'll have particular restaurants or products that can only receive a certain certification, which is of a lower standard, and not another certification of a higher standard. So I like to touch upon this because sometimes people feel like kosher certification can include politics, and it could include money. Now that's all possible because we are human beings and there are human elements, and in order for kosher certification to work, it needs to be financially well structured. If there's no financial structure, it will fall apart. At the moment there is financial structure, then there is always the concern of how much money is how it's being dealt with. So there is that element, and therefore they do need to be held accountable. But one must also realize it's certainly not just that. There is certainly different levels and different standards amongst kosher agencies, as far as sometimes it goes back to different opinions amongst the rabbis as far as whether there is or there isn't a concern of insects, which was the latest discussion that we had. Walnuts, he brings us an example as often being infested with mites. They can be tested as follows. When the kernel is taken from the shell should be tapped on a warm surface. This will bring out the mites that remain in the shell. Great care should be taken concerning this. He actually gives us a recommendation that by knocking the shell on a warm surface, that will cause any mites to come out that otherwise you might not be noticing. As I said, these things vary from time according to time and place. Sometimes the rim of a container in which fruits were preserved in honey and sugar may contain mites. This area must be thoroughly cleansed, and some of the surface preserves removed until it is quite certain that no insects would have to present. So it can happen sometimes in a sweet insect where there may be some level of little fleas or insects that may have gotten there. I mean, in today's level of hygiene, you probably possibly want to throw the whole thing out, but not necessarily, at least from a halachic perspective. If it is just surface level, then you would be able to just remove that surface until you're sure. I guess this is a scenario where the fleas or the mites came in contact after it already became a jam. And since it was already jam, they're not going deep, they're just at surface level. But again, this boils down to time and place and seeing what works. Okay. If while cutting a fruit or radish with a knife, you happen to cut up a worm, so now you might say that I just make my knife not kosher. So you should wipe the knife very well, and from the radish or the fruit, scoop out a bit from the place where the worm was cut. So since knife has pressure, so if a person did cut into some kind of non-kosher insect, then the knife should be thoroughly cleaned with cold water, because if you use hot water, then you might actually cause the taste of the insect to get into the knife. And the area where the worm was found should be cut out from the sides to ensure that you are not eating the taste of that worm. Yeah, I hope that you're not on your way to supper. Continuing along, the interior of fish often contain worms, especially in the brain, the liver, the intestines, the mouth, the ears. This is especially true with a fish called hecht or pike, which contains thin, long worms. The places where they are commonly found must be thoroughly examined. In herrings, the thin worms are often found in the milk, and it therefore requires examination. In some regards, the outside of the fish near the fins and on the fins, in the mouth and behind the ears, are infested with very small insects that are round as a lintel. These places should be examined and scraped off very well. So, practically speaking, even with fish, one needs to be careful that one is not coming in contact with worms. If the worms found in cheese are not repulsive to you, they may be eaten as long as they are not completely separated from the cheese. So very interesting. If the worms developed within the cheese, and it's like almost like a part of the cheese, so if you don't find it repulsive, which I imagine you would, then it actually is not considered non-kosher. In fact, in a different context, the Shulchan Aruch says that after eating very rich cheeses, you need to wait 6 hours as if you ate meat, because it gives a very strong taste. And what's the definition of a very rich cheese? Either a cheese that's been sitting for 6 months, or a cheese that has developed worms. So somehow there was a certain richness to aged cheese as far as it developing worms, and those worms, as long as they have not separated from the cheese, would actually still be considered kosher. Fascinatingly enough. Okay. Many divine commandments are written in the Torah regarding insects. One who eats them transgresses many prohibitive commandments. The Torah, in other words, in many places speaks about not eating insects, many types of insects. They also defile the soul, as it is written, and you will be defiled through them. So it has a very negative effect on the neshama, v'nit meisem bam. Therefore, everyone must be very careful not to eat them inadvertently. So this is actually an area one should be particularly careful as far as checking fruits and vegetables or fish or any place where one might accidentally be eating insects, little fleas or whatever it is, to make sure that that doesn't happen. Even water we spoke about can sometimes be infested. Flour, nuts, all of these different scenarios. Okay, here's another general rule. If you ask a Rav a question concerning the permissibility of an item and he has forbidden it, you are not allowed to ask another Rav for his opinion about the same matter unless you inform him that the first Rav decided that it was forbidden. So that's an interesting message as far as rabbi hopping. If you like to, some people like to have many rabbis. Sometimes it actually is a little bit funny because somebody on the forum of rabbis, sometimes the rabbis asked a question and he anonymously posts that, he was just asked a question, taking away any personal information. And then another one or two rabbis say, funny, he asked me too. At which point, obviously doesn't reflect very well that a rabbi is given guidance from Hashem, Siyata Dishmaya. As I mentioned before, there's a famous story of I think it was the Chassam Sofer, and Moshe's great-grandfather, or great-great-grandfather, and as he was once asked a question, and they were testing him. They were trying to see if he would get the answer right. So they asked him the question, and he got it wrong. I think I'm confusing people. I don't think it's a Chassam Sofer. Anyhow, I'll have to get back to you on who it was. And so they said, Rabbi, we got you. So he said that you've lied to me. You asked the question. They didn't tell him that they were testing him. They asked it to him as a real question. You ask the question as if it actually happened. Had it actually happened, then I really hope that Hashem would have given me siyata dishmaya, heavenly assistance, to direct me to the right answer. But since you asked me about something that actually never happened, there was no need for divine assistance because there was no practical ramifications. So then with my own brain, I got lost. The rabbi certainly has siyata dishmaya, and asking a rabbi is not just trying to find somebody that's more knowledgeable than oneself, but actually tapping into direction from Hashem. Therefore, a person should have one rabbi. Also, as I've explained in the past, and has come up here as well, every rabbi, in addition to just being well versed with the text, will also have a certain level of tradition of what he heard from his rabbi. There's always a certain element of the law which remains oral. Not everything is a matter of just intelligence. So sometimes, just like the classic example of Sfardim and Ashkenazim, within Shulchan Aruch, it speaks about how for an Ashkenazi it is forbidden to eat rice on Pesach, and for a Sephardi it is absolutely allowed, permissible. So if you are a Sephardi Rav, then and you ask the question about rice, the answer will be yes. If you are an Ashkenazi Rav, the answer will be no. So a person needs to pick one rabbi and stick with it, because otherwise they're going to be they'll be losing their head, because the two answers that they'll be getting from two different places about either the same question or a different question might actually be contradictory. So certainly each person should choose for themselves one rabbi. And when a question comes and they want to get a second opinion, then what you do is you ask your rabbi, you say, can I discuss this with somebody else as well? Or as he says, you tell the second rabbi, this is what my rabbi told me, but I wanted to discuss this further. I had two such instances. I see it's hit 5:20, so I'll say it very briefly. The first instance was I had a question of which hand I need to put on my tefillin. There's a big debate as far as for myself, which hand I need to put on tefillin. And before my bar mitzvah, my father told me that there's a question about which hand you need to put on tefillin. And then he came back to me and he showed me some text inside from the Shulchan Aruch, and I did what I did. And about 10 years later, I was reading a book that had been published for people with unique scenarios as far as which hand to put it on, like myself, somewhat of a lefty, somewhat of a righty. And the book said that I needed to do the opposite, and it said I was doing it wrong. So what did I do? I called my rabbi in South Africa and said, I just read in this book. I also emailed the author of the book and said, I'd love to, could you send me your sources? But as far as knowing what I should do, that was just for fun, kind of, to learn more about the subject. And the author of the book sent me a lot of material to prove his point. But for what I should actually do, I called my rabbi in South Africa and he said, your father called me 10 years ago before your bar mitzvah and he asked me. And I told him, but if you want to look at it further, you want to look into it some more, there's an expert rabbi in Kfar Chabad, and go and speak to him. And so I got the blessings of my first rabbi, and I got on a bus to Kfar Chabad, and I met with the second rabbi, and I told the second rabbi, I read in the book, which says I'm doing it all wrong. And he basically said, nah, whatever it says in that book, that's not reliable. I have a tradition that I heard from this rabbi and from that rabbi that you're doing it right. So that was one story where I didn't want to just go to another rabbi. I had to first go back to my first. Another story was, there was a question whether I should keep 1 day or 2 days Yom Tov in Israel, because an Israeli only keeps 1 day Yom Tov. But if somebody is visiting, then he keeps 2. So it was a question whether I was considered to be visiting or living there while I was in yeshiva. So again, I heard one thing from my rabbi, and then I heard something else from another rabbi. So what did I do? I went back to my rabbi and I said, I just heard so-and-so from another rabbi. So he said, okay, let me call him up. So he called up the other rabbi in Israel, and they had a discussion together on the phone, and he called me back up and he said, you know what? Actually, I think you should do what you've heard from this other rabbi now that I've discussed it further. Or to be fair, my rabbi, I had never really asked. It was my understanding that I assumed. And once anyhow, the point is that don't go rabbi hopping, rather be in touch with everybody and let it be worked out as a team so that you could have Hashem's divine assistance to guide you to be the best Jew that you